This is one of those cases that sounds like fiction until you realize how ordinary its beginning was. No stranger in a van, no dark alley, just a college kid, living alone for the first time, doing the things 19-year-olds do, and then, one night, gone. Let's start with who she actually was, because true crime stories have a bad habit of turning victims into props. Courtney Megan Coco was born in March of 1985, the youngest of 3 girls raised by her mother, Stephanie Bellegarde. She grew up with 2 older sisters, Heather and Lace, and by all accounts she was the baby of the family in every sense. Doted on, protected, a little spoiled maybe, but in the way loved kids are. She played baseball starting at age 5. She graduated high school in 2003 and enrolled at Northwestern State University to study criminal justice in almost eerie detail, given what would happen to her. To pay her way through school, she worked part-time as a receptionist at a local dental office. She'd just gotten her own apartment in Alexandria. She was building a life. And then on the night of October 1st, 2004, somebody ended it. Here's what we know about that night, pieced together slowly, painfully, over years. Courtney was last seen alive that evening. Sometime around midnight, inside her own apartment, she was killed. Investigators would later come to believe she was strangled, smothered, according to some accounts inside her home. One detail stuck with detectives for years afterward. Her comforter, the blanket off her own bed, was missing from the apartment. It doesn't take much imagination to guess what that might have been used for. Whoever did this didn't leave her there. Her body was moved, placed in the trunk of her own Pontiac Bonneville, and driven roughly 200 miles east across the state line into Texas. The car ended up abandoned in Houston. Her body ended up somewhere else entirely, in front of a derelict, abandoned house in a small town called Winnie, Texas, just off the interstate. A local farmer driving past noticed something wasn't right and called it in. That was October 4th, 2004, 3 days after anyone had last seen her alive. By the time she was found, her body had been outside for days in the Texas heat, and decomposition had already taken its toll. That single fact would end up shaping and crippling this investigation for the next 17 years. Because a badly decomposed body doesn't give up its secrets easily, the medical examiner couldn't even pin down an exact cause of death. They knew it was a homicide, they just couldn't prove precisely how, or definitively tie it to anyone. Meanwhile, back in Alexandria, the case had already started spinning off strange little threads. Just before Courtney died, she'd reported a string of burglaries at her apartment break-ins that, at the time, seemed unconnected, maybe just bad luck, a young woman living alone getting targeted by opportunists. Nobody could prove they were related to what happened to her, but they never quite left the back of investigators' minds either. And there was her phone it turned up sold to a teenage boy who told police he'd bought it from 2 men. 2 men who were seen near her abandoned car. Witnesses gave descriptions. None of it led anywhere solid. No names, no arrests, no answers. Just a trail that kept going cold every time someone tried to follow it. So the case did what cold cases do. It sat. Detectives moved on to other files. Years passed. Courtney Coco became a name in a folder, a photo in a newspaper archive, a story people in Alexandria vaguely remembered but couldn't quite recall the details of, except for one person who refused to let it sit. Her mother. Stephanie Bellegarde made a promise at her daughter's grave, kneeling there, grieving. She said out loud that she was going to find out who put her daughter in the ground, and that if she lived long enough, she'd see it through herself. That's not a movie line. That's a mother talking to a headstone. And she meant it. For 15 years, that promise looked less like a plan and more like grief with nowhere to go. The police had done what they could with what they had, which by 2019 wasn't much. DNA technology had improved since 2004, sure, but there wasn't a suspect to test it against. What the case needed wasn't a lab. It was noise public attention, new eyes, someone willing to drag a dead file back into the light. That someone turned out to be a retired homicide detective named Woody Overton, who by then had reinvented himself as a podcaster, running a show called Real Life, Real Crime. Bellegarde reached out to him in 2019, and Overton, who by all accounts had built a reputation doing exactly this kind of work, decided to take the case on. What he produced wasn't a single episode. It was an 18-part investigative series, all built around one question, which also became the series title, Who Killed Courtney Coco? And it worked, in the way these things sometimes actually do work. The series didn't solve the case by itself, but it did what 15 years of official silence hadn't. It got people talking. Tips started coming in. Old acquaintances, old neighbors, people who'd maybe heard something back in 2004 and never thought it mattered, suddenly had somewhere to send that information. The Alexandria Police Department took notice. In 2018, even slightly before the podcast fully kicked off, a detective named Tanner Dryden had already been assigned to take another crack at the cold case. Between Dryden's renewed police work and the public pressure generated by Overton's podcast, the investigation that had been frozen for a decade and a half finally started moving again. And here's the part of this story that actually turns your stomach a little, because it's not a stranger. It's not some random man passing through town. The name that eventually surfaced was David Anthony Burns. Burns wasn't a nobody to this family. In 2004, he was engaged to Courtney's older sister, Lace. He'd been around. He'd been, in some sense, family or about to be. He'd stood at Courtney's gravesite with the rest of them. When Stephanie and her daughters made a trip out to Winnie, Texas to leave a handmade cross at the abandoned house where Courtney's body had been found, they brought a priest along, and Burns was reportedly there too, part of the group grieving alongside them. For 17 years, he was inside the circle of people mourning Courtney Coco. On April 13, 2021, police arrested him. He was 45 years old at the time, living on Hot Wells Road, and he was charged with second-degree murder following a grand jury indictment. Alexandria police credited Detective Dryden's years of dogged work on the file and, implicitly, the wave of attention the podcast had generated with finally producing enough to bring charges. But enough to charge and enough to convict are two very different bars, and this case sat right on that line for its entire run through the courts. There was no smoking gun here. No DNA hit, no confession caught on tape, no forensic slam dunk. What the prosecution had, by the time this went to trial in 2022, was thinner than you'd expect for a case that took 17 years to bring. A witness in Texas came forward claiming to have seen a man matching Burns' description backing a vehicle out near the abandoned building where Courtney's body was eventually found. Memory, notably being recalled and offered up nearly 2 decades after the fact. Prosecutors also pointed to statements they characterized as Burns effectively confessing, or at least admitting, some involvement in disposing of Courtney's body. The defense unsurprisingly saw it very differently. That they argued the identification was shaky at best, built on a witness trying to place a face at a specific spot from 18 years in the past, hardly the kind of certainty you'd want underpinning a murder conviction. And then there was the medical question, which honestly might be the strangest wrinkle in the whole case. Experts hired by the defense didn't just dispute how Courtney died, they questioned whether she'd even been murdered at all, suggesting the possibility of an accidental overdose rather than a homicide. Think about that for a second. 17 years, an 18-episode podcast investigation, an arrest, a trial, and there were still expert witnesses standing up in a Louisiana courtroom arguing about whether this was even a murder in the first place. One more thread tying this together, and it's the kind of detail that makes a courtroom go quiet. Courtney's own sister, Lace, the woman who had been engaged to David Anthony Burns, took the stand and testified against him. Whatever was said in that testimony, it was enough to matter. A family already broken by one loss was forced to relive it publicly, with one sister effectively pointing at the man she'd once planned to marry. On October 31, 2022, Halloween, for what it's worth, a jury convicted David Anthony Burns of killing Courtney Coco. A little less than a month later, on November 29, 2022, Judge Mary Doggett sentenced him in the Rapides Parish Courthouse to life in prison without the possibility of parole, probation, or a suspended sentence. His attorney had tried, right up to the sentencing hearing, to get the conviction thrown out, arguing for an acquittal, then for a new trial. Both attempts failed. Except that's not actually where this story ends, and that's the part that makes it so uncomfortable. Burns appealed. And when the case reached the Louisiana Court of Appeal, the panel reviewing it didn't just consider his argument, they agreed with a version of it. Their review found the evidence supporting a second-degree murder conviction insufficient. The identification, made after nearly 2 decades by a single witness placing him near the dump site, wasn't enough on its own to carry a conviction of that weight. Add in the genuine expert-level dispute over whether Courtney's death was even a homicide to begin with, rather than an accidental overdose, and the appellate court found the state simply hadn't proven its case to the standard the law requires. So where does that leave things? It leaves a mother who buried her daughter, waited 17 years, funded through sheer public pressure and a podcaster's persistence, the reopening of a case everyone else had given up on, watched a jury finally convict the man she believed responsible, and then watched an appellate court question whether that conviction should stand at all. It leaves a sister who testified against the man she once planned to marry. It leaves a family still living inside a story that refuses to close cleanly even now, more than 20 years after a 19-year-old criminal justice student vanished from her own apartment on a quiet October night. The case has become fodder for the true crime machine